Thank you very much. My name is Jun-hyung Kim, Chancellor of KNDA. I'm very honored to participate this really important symposium as a presider moderator for session 3. And we all know that we are already so used to this small gathering and online and then the Zoom kind of format. Any problem? No. Oh, okay. Actually, I don't have any specific expertise on these issues, but my major is international politics, so I cannot get away from this issue. And I have a few basic knowledge on this, so I'm going to perform as a just timekeeper and moderator purely. And we have 3 excellent experts, panelists in the sessions. And the session's thesis is how to progress the NPT's political commitment. What I heard before I came to this podium that we have 3 panelists. The one panelist, Dr. Borrie, will give us a video clip, and I don't think he can join us for the discussion sessions, but we'd like to invite him and as a second panelist. And we have Dr. Bonggeun here, so we only 2 people in the podium. We are alone, but and Mr. Kimball will be joining through online. Okay, without wasting time, that we're jumping to panelist presentations. Starting with Mr. Daryl G. Kimball. He is the executive director of the Arms Control Association and publisher of the organization's monthly journal, Arms Control Today, since September 2001. He has a long list of resume, and you can refer to his booklet or on the homepage of this symposium. Is Mr. Daryl Kimball is online?
Yes, I am.
Okay, good to see you. How are you?
Good.
Okay, are you ready to go?
I'm ready.
Okay. Like a 15 minutes or so?
Yes, and I have my PowerPoint presentation queued up. So if that could be ready, I would appreciate that. All right, well, listen, I am very honored to be here to speak at this 5th Connect Nonproliferation Symposium here from the United States. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to outline what I believe are some of the important ways in which the United States and Russia can help advance non-proliferation treaty disarmament goals, and also for the United States to try to engage with China on nuclear arms control and disarmament. So as we've heard from many of the previous speakers, as NPT states parties prepare to meet for the 10th review conference, the pandemic delayed review conference, tensions among the world's nuclear armed states is rising. Key non-proliferation treaty commitments remain largely unfulfilled, and agreements that have kept nuclear non-proliferation and nuclear competition in check have been eroding, including the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, and others are in serious jeopardy. And of course, we also have the longstanding danger posed by North Korea's nuclear and missile programs that still exist, that continue to demand a serious commitment to a step-for-step diplomatic process to advance peace and denuclearization on the peninsula. So if I could ask for the first slide to come up, please, I would appreciate that. One moment. Yes, I can do a screen share if you give me just a moment. All right. Is that visible?
Yes, perfect. Go ahead.
All right, very good. So some of these factors are going to make it very difficult for the states parties to reach consensus at the upcoming conference on a package of measures to strengthen the implementation and compliance with the treaty, and constructive engagement by all NPT member states is critical to success. As Ambassador Holmgren noted in his keynote address earlier, the majority of NPT states want to see a reaffirmation of past NPT commitments and agreement on a forward-looking action plan on disarmament and non-proliferation steps. These steps include those that were outlined and agreed to in the 1995 NPT Review Conference, the 2000 conference, the 2010 NPT Review Conferences. And it's especially important to move ahead on those steps related to Article 6. Now, if, however, nuclear arms insist, as the Trump administration did, that they can walk away from the commitments made at previous NPT review conferences, it's going to undermine the entire review conference and the credibility of the nuclear weapon states' commitments to uphold their Article 6 treaty obligations on nuclear disarmament. So as the Biden administration comes in and changes slightly the direction of the United States approach, I think they have an opportunity and an obligation to signal that the United States remains committed to the goals and objectives of the treaty, to fulfilling the 2010 NPT Review Conference action plan, particularly those action steps related to nuclear disarmament. But it's going to be important that the United States and Russia do more. And the decision by President Biden and President Putin early this year to extend the 2010 New Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty for 5 years was necessary. It was smart, but it is not nearly enough to help advance the disarmament objectives of the Nonproliferation Treaty. And it's going to be important for the United States and Russia to find ways to manage their growing nuclear competition. And I have some confidence that President Biden is going to be trying to do this at the upcoming summit on June 16th in Geneva that he will have with President Putin. Earlier this year, President Biden said, throughout our long history of competition, our two countries have been able to find ways to manage tensions and to keep them from escalating out of control. It is, of course, by no means certain that the two sides, the United States and Russia, will have enough good luck. Will continue to exercise responsible leadership and managerial competence to avoid catastrophe. So they're going to have to, President Biden and President Putin, use their planned summit to reaffirm their commitments to pursue further negotiations beyond New START and to begin talks aimed at further cuts in their still excessive nuclear arsenals. And as you can see from this chart, the United States and Russia have made modest progress since 2010 in reducing their deployed strategic nuclear arsenals, but the two sides still have approximately 1,400 nuclear weapons, deployed strategic nuclear weapons each, many of which are primed for prompt launch. These arsenals far exceed those of any other nuclear armed state. So serious sustained disarmament diplomacy is essential, but achieving further progress between the United States and Russia, the two largest nuclear powers, is going to be very difficult because, of course, of the tensions in the US-Russian relationship over Russia's invasion of the Crimean region in 2014, and also because disarmament has been pushed to the back burner of the relationship between the United States and Russia. So it's very important that this upcoming summit brings arms control and strategic stability back to the forefront. So the two sides also are facing the deadline of the New START treaty, which was extended for 5 years, but it will expire in a short 5 years in 2026. So they need to move quickly to find effective new solutions before New START expires. And to make progress, they're going to need to tackle several difficult but resolvable issues in 4 main areas. The first, of course, is to find some ways to further reduce their still excessive strategic arsenals, including new types of nuclear weapon systems that Russia is developing and the United States is considering developing. Now, one thing to remember that gives us, I think, some hope is that in 2013, over 7 years ago, the Obama administration, with input from the Pentagon, determined that the United States could further reduce its strategic nuclear force by 1/3 below New START levels to approximately 1,000 warheads and still meet core deterrence requirements. Unfortunately, Russia at the time turned down the offer of talks towards that goal. But the point here is that both sides have room to further cut their large strategic nuclear arsenals. The second issue they're, of course, going to have to deal with is trying to bring tactical nuclear weapons into the arms control process. I think with some beginning steps, accounting for how many non-strategic nuclear weapons each side has. That could involve making detailed declarations on their respective stockpiles. It could include declarations on the warheads that are deployed as well as those in storage. But in my view, progress on arms control and disarmament relating to non-strategic nuclear weapons should not become a prerequisite for lower ceilings in the two sides' strategic arsenals. And what we may be looking at here as the United States and Russia move forward is not one master agreement that covers all of these issues, but a combination of agreements that address each of these issues in slightly different ways. The other thing that's going to be important is discussions on missile defense. Russia has long been concerned about the growing US missile defense capabilities, especially theater range missile interceptors that have capabilities against strategic offensive missiles. And the United States just tested an SM-3 Block 2A missile recently against a long-range target, which gives Russia even further concern. So US efforts to further limit Russian nuclear weapons and to bring China into the arms control process are unlikely to gain traction unless Washington agrees to discuss seriously constraints on its long-range missile defense capabilities. This is very difficult domestically in the United States, where there is strong support for unlimited missile defense. But there should be some way to field sufficient numbers of US missile interceptors to mitigate the threat of a limited attack against North Korea or maybe Iran by agreeing to binding limits on the quantity, location, and capability of missile systems that might relate to Russia or China. And then the other main area that the two sides are going to have to address is what to do with respect to intermediate range missiles in the absence of the INF treaty. There is the risk now that Russia will increase the number of INF range missiles that it already has begun to deploy. The United States is considering non-nuclear ground-launched cruise missiles for Europe. We'll see if the Biden administration moves forward with that. They are rethinking that. But the US and Russia need to think about how they can head off a new race similar to the one we saw in the 70s and 80s involving intermediate range missiles, possibly nuclear armed, in Europe. And of course, this also has implications for Asia. And then, of course, they're also going to have to think about some new understandings and measures to reduce nuclear risk in the cyber age. I think one particular area that is ripe for agreement is a understanding and agreement not to use cyber offensive capabilities to attack or otherwise interfere with each other's nuclear command and control capabilities. Now, to date, most nuclear arms control has focused on, and most of the NPT focus on disarmament has focused on what the United States and Russia need to do, and they need to do a lot more, but other states are improving their capabilities, including other nuclear armed members of the NPT, such as China. And they too have nuclear disarmament responsibilities and obligations. And so while China's arsenal is approximately 1/10 the size of the deployed arsenals, the active arsenals that the United States and Russia have, it is still a dangerous nuclear arsenal. According to US projections, China could increase the size of its relatively smaller arsenal. It's deploying new solid fuel missiles that can be launched more quickly. It's increasing the number of its long-range missiles that are armed with multiple warheads. More of its ICBMs are on mobile trucks, and it's continuing to improve its sea-based missile force. So these moves, while concerning, in my view, don't justify alarmism. China appears to be seeking to match US nuclear, is not seeking to match US nuclear capabilities. It seems to be instead seeking to diversify its nuclear force so it can maintain a nuclear retaliatory deterrent to withstand a potential US conventional or nuclear strike. Now, China has resisted engaging in nuclear arms control talks with the United States and with the United States and Russia. It's argued that it will only engage in arms control talks when Russian and US stockpiles are at or below 1,000 nuclear weapons. That's understandable, but China does have responsibilities under Article 6 to contribute to an end of the arms race and to contribute to disarmament. So how can we and where can we engage in arms control with China? There is currently no bilateral US-China channel, but there are other opportunities to engage. So, I think one mistake that should be avoided by the United States and other countries is to simply demand that China should join arms control process, that China must do this if it wants to be a leader. We saw the the Trump administration try this and fail this in 2019 and 2020. Instead, the Biden administration can and should adopt a more pragmatic approach that takes into account Chinese concerns, because as I think everyone here knows, effective arms control involves reciprocity and give and take. So to start, the Biden administration could and should propose a new bilateral nuclear security dialogue to clarify issues relating to each other's nuclear postures, to establish better lines of communication that could help reduce risks in a crisis. And the other thing that could be done is the State Department could invite Chinese diplomats to develop a plan for fortifying something called the P5 process on nuclear weapons policy and risk reduction that has been in place since 2007. So rather than demanding that Russia engage in a new forum, there is already this P5 forum which exists, in which France is to host this coming year. So in that context, they could explore some of the nuclear risk reduction ideas that the Stockholm Initiative has outlined, for instance, a joint verification exercise based on past US-Russian experience. They could negotiate a common system for reporting on the respective nuclear weapons holdings. They could also, the 5 countries could discuss a joint understanding that cyber capabilities should not be used to interfere with other states' nuclear command and control. Now, an even more ambitious idea, but I think is one worth pursuing by both Washington and Moscow, would be for those 2 countries to propose that the other P5 states, including China, freeze the size of their nuclear stockpiles so long as the United States and Russia continue to make progress in achieving deeper nuclear reductions. So those are some ideas about engaging with China. But ultimately, when it comes to the NPT Review Conference, there is going to be the hard work, as some of the youth tried in the NPT model that we were just hearing about. They need to work out an agreement about updating the earlier action plans and commitments, not just on the disarmament pillar, but on the nonproliferation and peaceful uses pillar. And what's I think encouraging is that there's significant convergence between several of the cross-regional groups on key elements that could be incorporated in an updated disarmament action plan. Who are these regional groups that I'm thinking about? There is the non-aligned movement. There's the New Agenda Coalition. There's the Stockholm Initiative. There's the Nonproliferation and Disarmament Initiative. All of these cross-regional groupings and some other countries all support a number of key elements that were in the 2010 action plan, and they put forward some good ideas about how to update those ideas for 2021. And I would argue that the United States under the Biden administration would very likely support many of these elements. So if this conference happens this year, and of course we all know that there's some doubt that it will, I think there is a good chance of agreement to hammer out a common plan of action that calls for New START follow-on talks with the goal of a new agreement between the US and Russia before 2025, a call to have all nuclear weapon states engaged in the disarmament process, including a call for a cap on stockpile size and stockpile declarations, reaffirming support for the nuclear test moratoria, the de facto test moratoria, and prompt action towards entry into force of the CTBT, a call for halting the development of new types of nuclear weapons and warheads, and more. It's also important that the review conference address the new kid on the block, the new treaty, the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And part of the way that states parties, the NPT, can do this is to recognize in their consensus final conference document the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear war. But I think it's also important that states parties, especially the nuclear weapon states, recognize that the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons exists, and that the states that support it, which now number well over 50, you could argue well over 100, support it because they see this as a tangible contribution to their own NPT Article 6 disarmament obligations. In my view, studying this treaty, studying the NPT, I believe that TPNW strengthens the nonproliferation and disarmament norms enshrined in the NPT. It also strengthens the taboo against nuclear weapons themselves. It further delegitimizes, the TPNW does, nuclear weapons as instruments of power. So I think in general, the TPNW is a positive development, but of course the nuclear weapon states are not going to embrace it, but they need to recognize it. They need to stop undercutting the motivations, criticizing the motivations of those countries that have adopted it and advanced it. Those are some of the issues that I see that are going to be in play with this review conference and in the coming year. There's a lot of work to be done. These are some ideas that I hope many governments will pursue, and I look forward to your feedback and your questions. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kimball. Actually, you excellent for the excellent presentation. You laid out nicely about the challenges and work to do. At the same time, some encouraging things in the future. And let me remind you, the floor and the people participating online, they can ask questions, and we can later ask the presenters about this. And I have one question for I will save for the next discussion sessions. And next, Dr. Borrie, John Borrie, he's a senior research fellow in the WMD program at UNIDIR. His working experience has covered many aspects of arms control, disarmament, and humanitarian affairs. And he has published extensively on this issue and other topics. And his topic of presentation, humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons and progressing the NPT. I heard he sent video presentation, so we cannot ask him later on. But anyways, we're gonna show that to you.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this KNAC Nuclear Nonproliferation and Security Symposium. I'm sending you this video with my presentation rather than participating in person. And for that, my apologies, but it is the middle of the night here, Geneva time in Europe, so this is perhaps just a little easier for everybody. So I'm going to speak today about the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons, and to do that in the context of these discussions in this session on progressing the NPT. And I'm just going to outline for you my talk structure, but before that, my name is John Borrie. I'm a senior research fellow at UNIDIR, the UN Institute for Disarmament Research in Geneva. I'm a New Zealander by background, and for many years I've observed or participated in some of the processes related to nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation that extend to many of the things I mentioned today, including the humanitarian conferences, and later I observed the negotiations on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So I guess for that reason I am well placed to talk about some of the things here. In terms of my talk structure, I'm going to race through in the time I have allotted. I'm going to talk briefly about the context for humanitarian concerns about nuclear weapons, where these came from, because they're not new. The emergence of some post-Cold War humanitarian disarmament initiatives, because these have a bearing on what has happened on nuclear weapons. The TPNW and its emergence. The sort of challenges and the landscape that we see politically after the TPNW's adoption. And also I'm going to briefly talk about the future and what all of this might mean for the NPT in order to set you up for a discussion. So let's move on immediately. But I just want you to bear some points in mind from this condensed talk. The first point I want to make is that humanitarian effects are not new concerns in the nuclear context. But some of the forms of activism and diplomacy that emerged over the last few years were quite novel. They drew on other experiences, but they adapted those, and this helped create the momentum for some of the initiatives that I'll talk about. Another thing is, as shorthand, people working in this sector often talk about the humanitarian initiative when they mean the TPNW, but actually there's been no one humanitarian initiative. There were several interrelated initiatives, but these to some degree had lives of their own. And the TPNW process from 2016, 2017 emerged from those initiatives, but it wasn't synonymous with them. So that's an important point to bear in mind. And it's too early to say whether the TPNW will be effective, but in my opinion at least, and that of many others, it's unlikely it undermines the NPT. So that's something to bear in mind for the later part of this presentation and the subsequent discussion. And fifthly, in the longer run, humanitarian concerns and initiatives could strengthen support for the NPT and in the NPT for certain forms of activity that are unrelated to the TPNW. And that could include risk reduction, which is currently quite fashionable as a topic, something on which UNIDIR is also doing some work. Because after all, risk is probability times consequences, and so consequences, including humanitarian consequences, are relevant. Anyway, moving on, let's just talk briefly about some of the origins of concerns about nuclear weapons in humanitarian terms. And these, of course, go all the way back to 1945 and the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. And indeed, there are many archival pieces of evidence, for instance, eyewitness reports from the International Committee of the Red Cross at the time and their delegates of extreme concern about the level of devastation, and also a great deal of apprehension at the time about what the long-term impacts of effects like radiation might be on the long-term health of populations and of heredity. So humanitarian concerns were also clearly very prominent in the early Cold War nuclear disarmament movements. But quite quickly, nuclear disarmament found itself sort of sidelined, really, in terms of a way to respond to the new threats of nuclear weapons. It took really it was sidelined by nuclear deterrence as sort of a response. But throughout the Cold War, there were various studies and initiatives looking at the human and environmental impacts of nuclear war, and some of those were conducted under the auspices of the World Health Organization. And they're worth going back to have a look at, actually, some of these studies from the 1980s, for instance. But nuclear deterrence was the predominant paradigm, but it was in this context that in 1986, the US and Russian leaders, Reagan and Gorbachev, were able to come out with a statement that said that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. And this was restated in different forms several times, but it was very important, not just in the context of reducing strategic tensions and for arms control, but it was also a recognition of the devastating impacts that a nuclear war would have. In the post-Cold War period, we saw a relaxation of tensions, of course, and we saw nuclear and other strategic arms reductions. Some of these were negotiated between the US and the former Soviet Union. Some of these were unilateral, but they were very important. And in the 1990s, we saw also the emergence of new concepts and ideas about human security, of using individual human beings and their communities as reference points for security, in addition to just sort of state level security. And in particular, a 1994 UNDP Human Development Report was very influential in that regard, and there were a number of independent commissions. In that period, the 1990s also saw new forms of conflict bubbling up, new wars among the peoples, if you like, and these included, of course, conflicts in the Balkans and culminating in the 1999 NATO intervention in Kosovo to prevent Serbia taking over the province. This period also saw the emergence of new forms of process that were inspired by humanitarian concerns, and the real pioneer of this was the so-called Ottawa process that culminated in the 1997 Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention. And this was important because it had a number of features that weren't seen in prior arms control related initiatives. It had a very clear goal combined with a government civil society partnership. NGOs played prominent roles. There was a lot of independent evidence collected about the actual impacts of weapons, and not just a discussion about their perceived utility. And it was seen through a sort of humanitarian framing. And this led 10 years later to the Oslo process that culminated in the 2008 Convention on cluster munitions. And I've actually written a book about that, so you can see the cover of that there. You can explore that if you're interested by downloading from our website. I'll put the link to that at the end. So these sorts of initiatives were significant because they to some extent created a new model. But in the meantime, in 1995, of course, we'd seen the indefinite extension of the NPT. It was a difficult process, but it was achieved. And that really heightened expectations among many states that nuclear weapon states under the NPT would implement Article 6 to undertake negotiations in good faith on nuclear disarmament. But the ensuing 15-year period didn't really see that. We saw continued blockage in the CD, little progress on further nuclear reductions, and growing frustration. But in 2009, incoming President Barack Obama gave a very significant speech in Prague in which he underlined the humanitarian impacts of the use of nuclear weapons. And this contributed to the inclusion of humanitarian consequences language, or at least US acquiescence to that language, in the Review Conference 64-point action plan that was agreed in 2010. And this was a successful review conference in achieving a final outcome. It followed a failed review conference in 2005, and of course it was to precede another one in 2015. But it was an important achievement for reasons we'll get to in a moment. But in 2011, of course, we also saw the achievement of the New START treaty between the Americans and the Russians. And this was important because not only in its own right, but it sent mixed signals. One was, it became clear how difficult it would be for the US to achieve, or at least to get domestic ratification of further nuclear agreements. And of course, there was a price to pay for the administration in that they were really compelled to support a very expensive process of nuclear modernization for the future, which has also had lingering effects. But this mention of humanitarian consequences in the NPT 64-point action plan in 2010 led to the emergence of a number of initiatives, humanitarian initiatives, if you like. The first was a conference that was hosted and initiated by the Norwegian government in Oslo in 2013, attended by 125 or so states, attended by the UN, the Red Cross movement, and a number of invited scientific and other experts, including myself. But the 5 nuclear weapon states to the NPT didn't attend that. In fact, they démarched the Norwegians and essentially told them how disappointed they were with Norway for doing that. But the conference, which was to explore humanitarian consequences, was actually followed by conferences in Nayarit in Mexico, hosted by the Mexican government, and one hosted by the Austrian government in Vienna the following year. The nuclear weapon states again didn't participate in Mexico, but the Americans and the British did choose to participate in Vienna, quite possibly because they could see this process gathering momentum, and they were concerned about the impacts it might have on the 2015 NPT conference. So they did go to the Vienna conference. And alongside this, there were a bunch of other humanitarian initiatives, and these included joint statements by states in UN contexts, like the UN First Committee. There were a number of resolutions put forward on things that were humanitarian related. There was an Austrian pledge that Austria invited states to sign up to following the Vienna conference. And there were also initiatives at other levels, including a Red Cross, International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement process going on, and a number of studies are being produced. These included studies into the climatic effects of even a limited nuclear conflict. They included the UN looking at its capacity to respond to nuclear weapon detonations in a report that I co-authored, which was co-sponsored by UNDP and the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and a bunch of other things too. So humanitarian concerns were clearly to the fore when the 2015 NPT Review Conference rolled around. But that conference failed to achieve an outcome, ostensibly because of differences over the Middle East, which meant that the US, UK, and Canada were unwilling to join or to agree to the text put forward by the chair. But it was very clear that there were pretty serious divergences on how nuclear disarmament and humanitarian consequences should be represented in the background. But there was a resolution passed in the UN First Committee late in 2015 for a further UN open-ended working group on taking forward multilateral nuclear disarmament negotiations. That's quite a mouthful, but it was significant for reasons that we'll see in a moment. So these are some of the collective impressions which emerged from the humanitarian conferences. The selective impressions I've listed. I'm not going to go through them here in the interest of time, but they were significant in helping to shape the thinking of some states around this time. And of course, you had an emergent international NGO campaign, ICANN, which would later win the Nobel Peace Prize in 2018 for its role in the achievement of the TPNW. But the idea of many of these initiatives was to figure out how the NPT could be strengthened because of growing concerns that it was deteriorating, in part through lack of implementation of Article 6 by the nuclear weapon states and to some extent their allies. So in 2016, this UN open-ended working group met in Geneva under the chairmanship of Thailand. And at the end of the year, after its deliberations, well, in August, in fact, it voted on a report, voted because some states present put it to a vote, led by Australia. It's interesting also that all of the nuclear armed states stayed away from the OEWG, but most of their allies did participate. But nevertheless, this report came to a number of different recommendations. Some of those recommendations were quite anodyne, some related to things like nuclear risk reduction, but one of them recommended the initiation of negotiations in the UN on a nuclear ban treaty. And this was clearly not something everybody wanted to go along with, including the allies of the United States and others. So there was a vote, it went through, and a first committee resolution late that year went through and set up a process to negotiate what later would become the TPNW. This process would see the non-participation and quite a lot of resistance from the nuclear weapon states and most of their allies. There were 2 negotiation sessions, one in early 2017, but most of the negotiations happened in a 3-week period in July of that year. So a very compressed time period for those negotiations in New York, chaired by Costa Rica. And it would achieve a treaty that was a comprehensive prohibition of nuclear weapons, although of course not elimination of nuclear weapons, because none of the nuclear weapon possessors were present, and many indicated they had no intention of joining such a treaty. And the process had some hallmarks of what we had seen with these other humanitarian processes, as I mentioned. And there were various controversies coming out of the TPNW negotiations. This is just a brief recap of what the prohibitions in the TPNW entailed. I'm not going to go into much detail here because this is, after all, not explicitly a presentation just about the TPNW, but nevertheless, 122 states adopted it. 1 voted against, the Netherlands, which was the only US ally to participate in the negotiations, and Singapore abstained. So there were a number of controversies, not just with the fact that the TPNW was being negotiated at all, but one controversy was what the relationship of the TPNW and the NPT would be. For the states participating in the TPNW negotiations, it was clear that the TPNW should reinforce the NPT, but the nuclear weapon states were critical of this and argued it might undermine the NPT, and this is a debate that's gone on. But there were also, controversies about specific provisions within the treaty. Obviously, they're quite comprehensive prohibitions, which means that this would impact on the ability of states, for instance, allied to nuclear possessors to host nuclear weapons on their territory. And then there were controversies over Article 4, which relates to how do you verify that a state joining the treaty will give up its nuclear weapons if it has them. But the treaty was real achievement in humanitarian terms in some other ways. It set out provisions for helping survivors of nuclear weapon detonations in the communities, including nuclear weapon testing and environmental mediation, assistance and cooperation among states and so forth. So a very strong humanitarian dimension to the text. But after the TPNW was adopted in July 2017, the opposition and criticism of the nuclear weapon states and their allies, if anything, intensified. Some of these criticisms were founded, in fact, some were not. And in particular, these fears among some that the TPNW would hamper the NPT. But what we see now, really in the year since the adoption of the NPT and, sorry, the TPNW, and the TPNW achieved its 50 required ratifications to enter into force in January 2021. But what we've seen in the period since 2017 is a global nuclear context that's currently moving in the wrong direction. Increased tensions between the nuclear weapon states, the introduction of various strategic technologies with a bearing on the nuclear balance, increased multipolarity, regional tensions, of course, including in North Asia, your neighborhood, and all the attendant problems there. So there's an open question whether the TPNW will help in turning this around or will become irrelevant. And of course, it's very difficult to tell at this stage how effective the TPNW will be this early on. So there are a number of things in terms of looking to the future that bear thinking about. For the TPNW itself, there's an immediate challenge in setting up the structures it needs for implementation now that it's achieved entry into force. It's supposed to have its first meeting of states parties in Vienna in January 2022. That may now clash with the NPT RevCon, which to date has been already postponed twice from mid-2020, but might be rescheduled a third time to early 2022, so that will create some interesting problems. But the TPNW states parties will have to figure out how they implement the treaty in practical terms, how they resource the treaty, given that none of them are particularly large states, they're all non-nuclear weapon states, and how they meet the expectations of the different stakeholders involved, including civil society, such as ICANN and survivors and so forth. And of course, the TPNW, as I said, has been marketed by supporters as complementary to the NPT, but it's going to have to prove it. And that's relevant to the NPT because the NPT currently faces many challenges. And one of the concerns that has arisen that even reflecting the reality of the TPNW's existence could be difficult in an NPT setting, although there are some positive signs that both sides are cooling their heels a little bit lately, and we'll be able to come to some arrangement. And then there are broader questions of how humanitarian impacts or effects of nuclear weapons discourse can impact the international security discourse, and particularly the NPT. And in that context, there is some, I think, positive potential here. As I mentioned, nuclear risk reduction is one area that's emerged in recent years as one on which it seems most NPT states parties seem to be able to converge. They have different definitions of what risk reduction is, but sort of a discussion on how to reduce nuclear risk and also how that might revitalize nuclear disarmament efforts in due course really fits quite naturally with humanitarian consequences, because after all, nuclear risk is probability times consequences. So that'll be interesting. But there are also a lot of states now, TPNW states parties, who will be quite insistent that there be some sort of humanitarian consequences language maintained in NPT final outcomes. And that could be a point of friction, but it could be actually also a common platform to build the discourse and perhaps reduce some of the polarization that we've seen between nuclear weapon states and between nuclear weapon states and between nuclear weapon states and TPNW supporters in the TPNW context. So I think that brings me to the end. I've talked for long enough. but you can find many, many related publications, including on UNIDIR's website. All of these are in English. They're free, all available in PDF. We've been following these issues for many years, as I mentioned, and to some extent, I guess we've been feeding into the policy discourse as it's been evolving, and we also have a lot of work we've produced related to nuclear risk reduction and other aspects of nuclear non-proliferation, arms control and disarmament. So I encourage you to check those out at unidir.org. But I thank you for your attention today, and I wish you a good discussion. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Dr. John Borrie. Even though he cannot hear me now, I think he's in Europe, so I think it's very early in the morning because of time difference, so he couldn't join. But he talked about a very important part of this nuclear non-proliferations. These days we are talking about gaining the voice of human security. In that sense, I think nuclear issue is not just between the states. Finally, but not, last but not the least, I'm proudly introduce Dr. Bonggeun. He is the best expert the KNDA has. So he's going to talk about this issue with actually South Korea actually at the front line. So his thesis is the current status of nuclear disarmament as South Korean perspective. Stage is yours. Go ahead.
Let me begin with thanking KNDA and the President Kim Seok-chul for organizing this symposium. This KNDA symposium in nuclear non-proliferation and security has been a hallmark of South Korea's effort for nuclear disarmament, non-proliferation, nuclear security. But it was somehow suspended for the last few years, and I'm very glad that this KNDA symposium is back again. My presentation is made of 3 parts. First, beginning with why are there a resurging, recurrent interest in nuclear disarmament? We thought nuclear disarmament issue is one for a Cold War era. But now we are living in post-Cold War era in 21st century. But somehow we are seeing a resurging interest in nuclear disarmament. So my first question will be why is that so? Secondly, I will compare competing and contending approaches to nuclear disarmament. Previously, we watched the 2 presentations. I think that they are representing, each one is presenting one approaches. And I will compare, I think there are 3 approaches. I will compare and see what are their characteristics. And lastly, I will look into what is South Korea's position in nuclear disarmament and some characteristics of this issue in as long as South Korea is concerned. Probably you are very familiar with this picture, and this is in the yard of United Nations building in New York, and probably in this statue behind there's a bridge. There might be a bridge, some connecting, this crossing Manhattan River probably. All humans have had a dream of pounding this sword into plowshare. But this is not a usual sword. This is a nuclear weapon. But this dream remains unfulfilled, and still we are struggling. And after 50 years of NPT, where all countries promised to stop proliferating and also pursue nuclear disarmament, now we have to raise this question again. Are we safer from nuclear weapons and war, nuclear war? And after 50 years, we have seen this in this post-Cold War era, a very dramatic decrease of numbers of nuclear weapons. And beginning with around 1985, when Gorbachev became president, and he had a INF treaty with President Gorbachev. Ever since we are entering 1991, a disintegration of Soviet Union, and there was a gradual decrease and a further decrease of nuclear weapons. But we are somehow concerned. This is not going to continue anymore. So my answer to the question of are we safer today than 50 years ago? And living in South Korea, I'm okay, but people who are in the middle of this global nuclear arms race are not feeling in that way. They said last year, we are 100 seconds to midnight doomsday clock. And we used to have we used to feel pretty safer when Cold War ended. 1991, there was 17 minutes to the doomsday night. But today we are the very closest ever since this doomsday clock was invented in 1945. So while we are behaving normally, we are very, very dangerous situation. That was what this clock was saying. And then why is that so? In fact, when Cold War ended, people was praising that the end of history. The end of history means that the end of a history of a greater power politics, the end of a history of a great wars. So we thought that this, we are not going to have any great wars and arms race. But however, the end of history has ended during the last about 5-10 years. History, greater power politics, geopolitics returns. And there was lots of warnings on this coming greater power politics, greater power wars, and probably accompanied by nuclear conflicts. So nowadays, strategic competition, arms build-up, arms race, including nuclear arms, are raising. While we are talking about the end of Cold War, still people who are working in this study of a strategic conflict and the strategist and the geopolitician theorists are having this image forever. So for them, there is no eternal peace. They just have this eternal power competition among big powers. And we thought that there was ended up, but it was returning again. And seeing this kind of return of greater power politics and arms race, as it was mentioned earlier, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres warns, and he was publishing this report, warning us that the danger of coming arms race and arms conflict. So the title was Securing Our Common Future. I want to just have your attention to these issues. In the second bullet here, why should we reinvigorate the nuclear disarmament efforts today? So what's wrong? What happened during the last 10 years? And in his analysis, and I 100% agree with him that these are some of the factors that we have to be concerned. First, dangers of emerging technologies. These new technologies are even dangerous. They are sharper, they are more intrusive, they are smarter. So they are more dangerous than previous dumb technologies and analog technologies. And secondly, it was a very, I haven't heard this kind of a factor, but Secretary General Guterres pointed out this point. I think I very much agree with him that the post-Cold War generation, post-Cold War generations are ignorant of disarmament. They didn't know, they didn't experience great wars. They didn't experience the danger of nuclear wars. So they don't know how important it is, how imperative it is to have this consciousness of a nuclear disarmament. But modern generation don't. And the great power of competition returns and intensifies. And also while we are seeing quantitative reduction of nuclear weapons, but he's pointing out that the qualitative arms race is underway. I think you are very familiar with this name, Jared Diamond. He published a global bestseller, Guns, Germs, and Steels, way before we have this pandemic of COVID-19. So it was no wonder that he was probably the most invited speakers, how he's seeing this coronavirus. And as you know, he's an anthropologist, civilizational anthropologist. And he was saying that he was talking to the people that viruses do not eliminate the humans and civilizations. So don't worry, it's going to come and gone. It's going to have some human cost, some sacrifice, but it's not going to kill us all. Then he was mentioning other factors that's going to kill all humans and that's going to eliminate the civilizations. What is that? He was raising specifically nuclear wars, nuclear arms race, and also he added the climate change and the exhaustion of resources. But he was very appropriately pointing out that the dangers of wars. That's why I'm raising that issue. Then despite all our wishes and desires for nuclear disarmaments, but it didn't happen often. And it's not going to happen today. Then what is conditions and what are causes of nuclear disarmament? I think only when these conditions are met, we have a better chance of having nuclear disarmament. What are they? Let me begin with the improvement of a security environment. Without having better security environment, it's not going to have it's very difficult to have nuclear disarmament. So only when end of Cold War, we could have a much bigger pace of accelerated pace of nuclear disarmament. But nowadays, returning of and worsening of a security environment, and I'm very doubtful that we could see nuclear disarmament any further. But however, as was mentioned earlier, previous session, this awareness of catastrophic consequences of nuclear war, military uselessness of excessive accumulation of nuclear weapons could help us pushing for nuclear disarmament. And also thirdly, political and moral demands, as was emphasized in Humanitarian Consequences Initiative. All these political and moral demands from international and the civil society have a better chance in pushing for this nuclear disarmament. I think TPNW and ICANN is great examples of them. And also, I want to emphasize this political decision factor. Even if there is a domestic political pressure and the demand for international society for nuclear disarmament, without the action or decision determination by political leaders. It cannot be decision that those cannot be made. In that sense, we should praise the role that President Gorbachev played, and the role this President Reagan played, and also President Obama when he was presenting his vision of nuclear-free world. Nowadays, so I think we are seeing some chances. I think, in my knowledge, President Biden is a non-proliferation people. I think probably he's going to pursue for nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. And he might be trying to fulfill that what Obama couldn't do when he was trying to reduce the significance of nuclear weapons in security policy. He couldn't. But nowadays, I think this kind of that effort could be revived. Here is three contending approaches to nuclear disarmament. I think this comprehensive nuclear disarmament was already presented by Borrie Jeon. It's about humanitarian consequences, and it's by it. The result was TPNW and nuclear weapons free zone, and also this kind of a comprehensive nuclear disarmament. Countries and the people are pushing for a ratification of a CTBT and starting a negotiation of a fissile material cut-off treaty. I think they are pushing for it very hard, but as you know, as we recognize, it was not really has gone far. And the third one is this utility of nuclear deterrence. I think those people are very reluctant to push for disarmament. And I think probably at this moment, the more practical approach that the Korea is adopting and pursuing was this the middle one, phased nuclear disarmament approach. I think this is I think well realized in this Stockholm Initiative, stepping stone approach. And also, I think they are pushing for the CTBT, FMCT. In that sense, it's a part of a comprehensive approach. But they are looking at the very practical ways, knowing that at this moment, it's not going to be realized. So I think their primary focus at the moment is reducing the dangers of nuclear weapons. So nuclear risk reduction is their primary focus. And also, of course, they are pushing for addressing this nuclear disarmament by having better security environment. I will skip this. This is a program of Secretary General Guterres, another program, and also we know that all these are contained already in this document adopted 10 years ago at the 2000 NPT Review Conference. I think all these practical steps, if they are implemented, I think we could live in a much better world. I think all these programs need to be on the table, should be pushed somehow. Let me jump to finally this South Korea's Republic of Korea's nuclear disarmament agenda. In fact, I have to confess that in the past, we had a very low interest or almost no interest in nuclear disarmament issues because we are so preoccupied with deterring North Korea's aggression and nuclear development. But nowadays, as you know, Korea is becoming a middle power who want to play a very active role in promoting and enhancing global peace and security and stability. In that sense, after we hosted the 2012 Global Nuclear Security Summit, we are very actively engaging in non-proliferation nuclear disarmament agenda on a global scale. So this is, and the second point, this is what South Korea is doing ever since we participated in and hosted the Seoul Nuclear Security Summit. We are fully supporting Secretary General's agenda for disarmament. And also we are participating in a Stockholm Initiative In fact, this is the first ever South Korea's participation in any non-proliferation, nuclear disarmament initiative. So this is a very notable. And also we participated in IPNTV and the KNDA initiative. And also, as was mentioned, presented earlier, we proposed the UN General Assembly resolution on youth disarmament and non-proliferation. I think there was a very significant achievement about South Korea's part in their effort to contribute to global peace. This is my final slide. Then what is our agenda, and not really policy agenda? I'm not really part of government, so I don't know. But as long as our policy community is concerned, we have this research agenda. First, North Korean nuclear problem. We need to get rid of DPRK nuclear weapons. And but what are the lessons from nuclear disarmament that we could apply to denuclearization of North Korea? And also, denuclearization process, we need to ask for nuclear, we need to have a verification on DPRK nuclear weapons and the facilities. But the previous ones that we have was very intrusive, that DPRK was not going to accept it. Then what are less intrusive verification methods learned from nuclear disarmament cases that we could apply to North Korea? And also we need to reduce nuclear risks of the DPRK nuclear weapons. I think there are several cases, I will skip them. And also DPRK with nuclear security problem. It's not only a non-proliferation problem, but also a nuclear security problem. So we need to apply that nuclear security method to the DPRK. How do we do it? And also one of the very thorny problem in solving this problem was how do we provide a security assurance to the DPRK? In fact, in this nuclear weapon-free zone, they have a very strong case for negative security assurance. Then how do we apply this NSA to the DPRK? Those are the kind of issues that we need to look into, and we need to come up with I hope to come up with some answers. And also in this region, probably this region, one of the rare regions in the world without nuclear weapon-free zone. So if we are going to apply, bring in nuclear weapon-free zone concept to the region, how do we do it? Those are very serious issues that we need to look into. I think I better stop it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jeon. Actually, he is the connecting point to this field of nuclear proliferation. I learned a lot from him. Do we have any questions online? And let me have it. And let me, yeah, questions from floor, Ambassador Shin.
The Chancellor Kim and three presenters. It's a very comprehensive, and we learn a lot about current situation and what's the task to do for the international community. My question addressed to both Dr. Kimball and John Borrie, but since John Borrie is not available, I go directly to Dr. Kimball. 2 points. One is TBNW, and second is the negative security assurance. Since I've been working in Vienna for 3 years, and before that, Geneva, I have some knowledge about this nuclear disarmament efforts. For TPNW, when I attended the IAEA Board of Governors meeting, there's a serious difference and gap between the nuclear weapon states and the states on the nuclear weapon umbrella of P5 countries. and non-nuclear weapon states who signed the TPNW. Example, the one conflict point. So these are two different separate treaties, but non-nuclear weapon states who signed the TPNW want IAEA take responsibility for the verification, implementing the safeguards. But IAEA, most of board of governors, they said IAEA has no mandate, no legal base to implement the requirement and the request from the TPNW. So this is a loophole. The conflict between TPNW and NPT appears in the Board of Governors meeting in the IAEA. And also, so the legal debate about the nuclear umbrella. So without the support and protection from nuclear weapon state, like the member of NATO and South Korea, Japan, if they remove unilaterally nuclear umbrella, what happened? On the threat from North Korean nuclear weapons and Chinese and Russia, the same situation probably to North Korea and the vice versa. So how do you think about the difference and conflict point between TPNW and NPT? So there'll be extremely difficult to narrow gap. Second point is NSA, negative security assurance. You elaborate well in the NPT action plan. This is very important and could be the viable alternative, how to converge two sides to make the negotiation process of nuclear disarmament can go ahead. Geneva Conference on Disarmament since 1996. So when the CTBT international agreement was agreed and entered into force, since then until now, more than 25 years, they didn't do anything. So is it sleeping? So what about the new idea, creative idea? Maybe Biden administration could take a similar approach of Obama administration to take seriously on the nuclear security negative security assurance international agreement. So in return, maybe United States and nuclear weapon state ask the developing countries and non-aligned countries to discuss and negotiate FMCT, Fissile Material Cut-off Treaty, together with other international disarmament and treaty negotiations. So maybe this is kind of package we can envisage. So, and additionally CTBT. So United States and China, Russia has common interest to prohibit nuclear testing in other countries, particularly North Korea and Iran. So China always insists, once United States ratify, China will ratify next days. So why not? Maybe United States invite China, Iran, North Korea, other Annex 2 countries, maybe they sign together at the same date. So including North Korea, when they have talks, USDPRK talks, don't forget the NPT as well as the CTBT could be the one of the agenda to address the issue of nuclear weapons for denuclearization of Korean Peninsula. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shin. Actually, I had a list of questions too, but I think already we offered you so much. So why don't the two panelists to answer the question and with your last comment, 3 to 4 minutes? Mr. Kim.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. So let me first address the question that was asked about the so-called argument that the TPNW and the NPT are not compatible. I mean, first of all, I would say that the TPNW simply says that there shall be a competent authority to verify compliance with the treaty and to possibly facilitate elimination. So the states that negotiated the treaty did not specify a particular entity. They did not say it should be the IAEA, even though some individual countries may have suggested that, but the treaty does not specify the IAEA. They didn't do so because the nuclear weapon states were not present in the negotiations. It's also a very difficult issue to address. The NPT itself does not talk about, which international authority or which new authority should be established in order to verify the completion of the nuclear weapon states' obligation to end the arms race and to achieve complete disarmament. So that is not an area that I see as a conflict. So I think it's also important to take a look at what the the TPNW states parties said themselves about the NPT. And in the treaty, in the TPNW, it makes it clear that they fully support the NPT, that they see the TPNW as compatible with the NPT. And they to summarize, I think most of the TPNW states see the TPNW as a way to reinforce the NPT principles and objectives, and they see the TPNW as an additional piece in the legal framework for eventually achieving disarmament. Let me just address a couple other questions. You had several. I agree with you that there needs to be progress on negotiations on legally binding negative security assurances to non-nuclear weapon states by the nuclear weapon states. The problems that we see at the Conference on Disarmament since 1996 are complex. I would suggest that it's not as simple as the non-nuclear weapon states asking for support for legally binding negative security assurances in exchange for their support for an FMCT. There are several interlocking conditionalities that have been established by certain countries, China, Pakistan, the United States, Russia, amongst others. So if the states want to negotiate the instruments that are kind of on the table at the CD, if they want to accomplish that, there has to be some agreement amongst, I think, some of the major powers, particularly the United States, Russia, and China, about allowing these negotiations to go forward in the CD. But I think the starting point for all this is for the NPT states parties to not just reaffirm the goal of legally binding negative security assurances, but to establish an agreement or a call to begin those negotiations by a certain date when they try to negotiate a final conference document at the NPT Review Conference. Finally, on the CTBT, I have been working to end nuclear testing for over 30 years of my career, and I'm a very strong supporter of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. One problem we have here, of course, is the political divisions in Washington that make achieving a 67 vote majority in the United States Senate for anything, let alone the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, next to impossible. I would just note that before we can make progress on the CTBT in the United States, there's going to have to be a solution to some of the accusations that have been made by the United States against Russia for allegedly undertaking activities inconsistent with the zero yield prohibition on nuclear explosions before we can achieve some traction and progress towards ratification by the United States Senate on the CTBT. That said, we should recognize that there are no countries today conducting nuclear test explosions. The CTBT is in many ways a success, even though the difficult entry into force mechanism makes its entry into force next to impossible. But I think there's still hope to move forward with some of the ratifications. And I think you're right to suggest that North Korea and the denuclearization process related to North Korea does need to involve some action by North Korea to sign the CTBT and to close the Punggye-ri nuclear test site. That's an important part of the denuclearization process that too few governments are talking about. So let me stop there and thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Kimball. Actually, the Dr. Bonggeun helped me to save time. Thank you very much. And actually, I didn't pressure him to stop, so don't get misunderstood. Thank you very much. And I said that I was going to perform just keeping time, but I did it poorly. But anyways, we started late, and especially before I end this session, that is special thanks to Kim Seok-chul, KNDA's president, and then 3 panelists. Thank you very much for your effort, and we are enlightened a lot. Thank you very much. And participants online, please continue to have an interest in this non-proliferation from now on. Thank you very much.